My name is Rosie. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my career, I've been described with words like reliable, steady, and easy to work with. No one has ever described me as intimidating. I work in corporate finance operations for a mid-sized firm in London. I'm the one who catches errors before audits do, the one who remembers contract clauses that everyone else skims past, the one who stays late during reporting season without announcing it to the room. If you met me at work, you'd probably assume I prefer staying in the background. And you'd be right. But not for the reasons people think. There's a difference between quiet and small. Most people never learn it. For years, I built a reputation for being dependable. Not flashy, not political, not loud in meetings. I let others present the summaries I drafted. I let managers take credit for the team's clean execution. I told myself that substance mattered more than visibility. And for a while, it did. Until the year my performance bonus was withheld. Not loudly, not dramatically, just adjusted, delayed, reclassified. On paper, it looked procedural. In reality, it was something else. This isn't a story about revenge. No shouting in conference rooms, no dramatic resignations, no public humiliation. It's about documentation, about the use of silence, used correctly, about understanding leverage long before you need to use it. It's about the day I sent a single email with one clause highlighted in red, and how the finance department processed the payment within 24 hours. But that moment, the one people imagine as triumphant, wasn't the beginning. It was the end of something much quieter. This story is about how easy it is to underestimate someone who doesn't compete for attention. How organizations slowly assign you a role, useful, agreeable, invisible, and how you can participate in that without realizing it. Most importantly, it's about the shift that happens when you stop reacting emotionally and start responding structurally. I won't exaggerate what happened. I won't pretend I was fearless. I wasn't. I was observant. And then I was prepared. If you've ever been the person people rely on, but don't fully see, you might recognize parts of this. Have you ever wondered what would happen if the quietest person in the room finally decided to act? To them, I was safe. Not the kind of safe that wins awards, the kind of safe that absorbs pressure. When quarterly reports tightened and senior leadership started using words like alignment and cost efficiency, I was the one managers looped in quietly, not to lead the conversation, just to make sure the numbers reconciled before anyone important saw them. Rosie will catch it, they'd say. And I would. I built forecasting models that prevented compliance penalties. I corrected vendor misallocations that could have escalated into legal disputes. I once found a discrepancy in a revenue recognition schedule that saved the company close to 6 figures in audit adjustments. But those wins were rarely attached to my name. In meetings, my contributions were often reframed. I'd send a detailed analysis to my direct manager, Daniel. He would summarize it in 2 slides and present it upstairs. He wasn't malicious. That's important. He just didn't think to change the pattern. And I didn't challenge it, because I believed something deeply. Something almost moral. If the work is strong enough, it will speak. But organizations don't reward work. They reward visibility, narrative, and timing. I understood the systems. I understood financial governance. I understood the policy. What I didn't fully understand yet was power. I was the dependable one. When someone missed a deadline, I reworked the schedule quietly. When another analyst made a modeling error, I corrected it before submission and explained it gently so they wouldn't feel embarrassed. I rarely pushed back in meetings. If someone interrupted me, I'd pause and let them finish. Not because I had nothing to say, but because I calculated that finishing the task mattered more than winning the moment. Over time, something subtle formed around me. An expectation. Rosie doesn't need recognition. Rosie doesn't escalate. Rosie will handle it. It wasn't disrespect, not yet. It was categorization. In performance reviews, I consistently scored exceeds expectations. My written feedback praised my thoroughness, my accuracy, and my stabilizing presence. But when promotion cycles came, I was told to continue building executive visibility. The phrase appeared every year, visibility, as if the countless hours refining systems weren't visible. As if clean audits appeared by accident. I told myself I preferred it this way. Less political tension, less spotlight, less scrutiny. I convinced myself that stability was influence. But influence without acknowledgement has limits. And here's the uncomfortable truth I had to admit later. I benefited from being underestimated. No one guarded themselves around me. No one filtered their emails carefully when copying me. No one worried that I might document inconsistencies. Because I wasn't seen as ambitious, just reliable. If you had asked my colleagues to describe me, they would have said, she's solid. She's low maintenance. She's not the type to make a fuss. And that last one, that was the quiet role forming around me. Not the strategic analyst. Not the financial safeguard. Not the architect behind stable operations. Just the one who wouldn't push. I didn't feel resentful. I felt placed, like a piece on a board that had already been assigned its square. And for years, I stayed there willingly, because being essential felt close enough to being valued. Until the first small cut made me question that difference. The first time something shifted, it didn't look like a betrayal. It looked administrative. It was the end of Q2, the kind of quarter where everyone speaks in abbreviations and exhaustion. We had just finalized a major vendor renegotiation that improved our margin by nearly 3%. It wasn't flashy, but in operational finance, 3% is oxygen. I had built the comparison models. I had flagged the unfavorable rollover clause in the draft agreement. I had rewritten the cost allocation breakdown that made the savings defensible. Daniel had presented the summary upstairs. That part was normal. What wasn't normal was the email that followed 2 weeks later. Given broader budget pressures, bonus allocations may be adjusted this cycle. It was sent department-wide. Neutral tone, corporate phrasing, no names attached. I didn't panic. Adjusted didn't mean eliminated, and my performance metrics were clear, quantifiable, strong. Still, something in me registered the language. Maybe adjusted. I opened my black notebook and wrote the date, not out of suspicion, out of habit. When compensation letters were distributed, mine included a paragraph that felt imprecise. While your contributions are valued, bonus calculations this year have incorporated departmental weighting adjustments. Departmental weighting adjustments. I read it 3 times. My percentage was lower than the previous year, despite stronger performance metrics. No disciplinary notes, no performance warnings, no budget freeze announced prior. Just an adjustment. I scheduled a one-on-one with Daniel, calmly. He looked uncomfortable before I even spoke. It's just how the allocation fell this year, he said. Nothing personal. Nothing personal. That phrase lands differently when your work has been entirely personal. I asked for clarification on the weighting formula. He didn't have it. Finance made the final call, he added. I worked in finance, specifically in the operational reporting unit that supplied the data those decisions relied on. So I asked a careful question. Was individual contributions scoring factored proportionally? He hesitated, just slightly. There were broader considerations. Broader. Another vague container word. Here's what's important. I didn't accuse. I didn't escalate. I didn't imply injustice. I thanked him for the clarification, because on the surface, nothing illegal had occurred. Companies have discretion. Bonus pools fluctuate, but something inside me tightened. Not anger, pattern recognition. I went back to my desk and reviewed my signed employment contract. Not because I expected a miracle clause, but because I wanted to understand the structure. There it was, Section 4.2. Performance-based bonuses will be calculated in alignment with documented individual metrics, unless otherwise formally amended in writing. Unless otherwise formally amended in writing. I checked my inbox. No amendment. No written notice of formula change specific to my role. Still, I didn't act, because at that point, it was one data point. One irregularity. And professionals don't escalate over one data point. But I highlighted the clause in my notebook. Not in red yet. Just marked. That was the first small cut, not the money. The vagueness. The assumption that I wouldn't examine it closely. The quiet belief that I would absorb it the way I absorbed everything else. Most people would have let it go. Some of my colleagues did. I didn't let it go. I stored it. And that made all the difference later. If the first cut was administrative, the second was social. And that's how normalization begins. Not with one large injustice, but with small adjustments that test your tolerance. After the bonus letter, nothing overtly changed. No one treated me poorly. No one criticized my work. No one excluded me from meetings. But subtle shifts began layering themselves into the rhythm of my days. In one strategy session, Daniel presented a process optimization I had built. Again. This time, when the CFO asked who developed the risk adjustment model, Daniel replied, "The team collaborated." The team. There were 6 of us in the room. Only one of us had written the model. I didn't correct him, not because I felt powerless, but because I felt strategic. Interrupting would have seemed territorial, defensive. I told myself credit is secondary to influence, but influence was becoming diluted. Later that month, a newer analyst, Tom, was nominated for a cross-functional visibility project. He was charismatic, comfortable speaking off script. His models were often sent back for revision. By me. During a casual conversation near the coffee station, I overheard someone say, "Tom has leadership presence." Leadership presence. It's a fascinating phrase. It rarely refers to competence. It refers to projection. Meanwhile, my performance review contained another familiar line. Continue building executive visibility. I began noticing how often my silence was interpreted as agreement. In meetings, when unrealistic deadlines were proposed, I would say carefully, "That timeline may require trade-offs and validation checks." Someone else would respond, "We'll manage." And because I didn't push further, the room would move on. Later, when issues surfaced, I would fix them quietly. The pattern reinforced itself. Rosie handles it. Rosie doesn't escalate. Rosie is stable. I rationalized everything. The bonus? Budget fluctuation. The credit dilution? Communication oversight. The visibility gap? Personality difference. There's a dangerous comfort in rationalizing. It allows you to stay in environments that subtly disadvantage you without confronting the emotional cost. And the emotional cost wasn't dramatic. It was cumulative. I found myself double-checking emails before sending them. Not for errors, but for tone. Making sure nothing sounded assertive enough to be misread. I began preemptively solving problems before they were noticed, eliminating the chance to be seen as the one who flagged them. I reduced friction. And in reducing friction, I reduced myself. One afternoon, I stayed late reconciling a reporting discrepancy caused by a rushed input from another department. At 8:47 p.m., I sent the corrected file to Daniel with a short explanation. The next morning, I received a one-line reply. "Great, thanks." No acknowledgement of the hours, no recognition of the save, just continuity. And here's the part that matters. I didn't feel rage. I felt expected. As if my reliability had converted into an obligation. The normalization of disrespect isn't loud. It's procedural. It happens when people begin assuming your extra effort is baseline, when your restraint becomes their convenience, when your silence becomes structural. I wasn't being bullied, I wasn't being attacked, I was being absorbed. And the more absorbed you are, the less visible your boundaries become. That was when I realized something uncomfortable. I had trained them. Every time I fixed something without documentation. Every time I declined to clarify authorship. Every time I accepted vagueness as an explanation. I was teaching them that I would not push. And once a system learns that, it optimizes around it. The bonus wasn't the real issue anymore. The issue was the role forming around me. Dependable, compliant, non-disruptive, useful, invisible. And I was still choosing to stay quiet. For now, there's a moment, subtle, almost imperceptible, when you realize you are no longer participating in a role. You are inhabiting one that was written for you. For me, that realization didn't arrive in conflict. It arrived in repetition. "Rosie, can you just sanity check this before we send it? Rosie, can you smooth this over with compliance? Rosie, can you take notes? Take notes." I had been in finance for over a decade. I had built multi-layered forecasting structures. I understood that regulatory frameworks were what most managers skimmed. And yet in cross-functional meetings, I was often handed the administrative layer. The cleanup, the clarification, the documentation. At first I didn't mind. Documentation is control. Notes are leverage. But the pattern revealed something deeper. I wasn't seen as a decision maker. I was seen as the stabilizer, the one who makes other people look organized. One afternoon, during an interdepartmental planning session, the head of strategy turned to Daniel and said, "You're lucky to have Rosie. She keeps everything running." He meant it as praise. Daniel smiled and said, "She's our safety net." Safety net. The phrase stayed with me long after the meeting ended. Safety nets are essential, but they are never the ones walking the tightrope. I began to observe more consciously. When leadership discussed expansion plans, my input was requested only after the outline was drafted, to validate feasibility, not to shape direction. When promotion discussions circulated informally, my name was associated with operational backbone, not strategic growth. The role was clear, reliable, detail-oriented, non-confrontational, low risk, and roles, once assigned, are self-reinforcing. Because I fulfilled it flawlessly, I delivered early. I anticipated objections. I softened my corrections with careful phrasing. Instead of saying, "This projection is structurally flawed," I would say, "There might be an alternative way to strengthen this." Instead of claiming ownership, I would write, "Happy to support further refinements." I thought I was being professional, but professionalism without boundaries can blur into self-erasure. One evening, I reviewed past performance evaluations side by side. 3 consecutive years. The language barely changed. Exceptionally dependable. Strong analytical contributor. Needs increased executive presence for advancement. The ceiling wasn't invisible. It was politely described. I closed the documents and sat very still. Not angry, just clear. They weren't withholding opportunity out of malice. They simply didn't see me as someone who would contest structural decisions. Why would they? I had never contested one. I had accepted the bonus adjustment. I had absorbed credit dilution. I had continued delivering at full capacity. From their perspective, the system was functioning perfectly. And here's the uncomfortable truth. It was, just not for me. That night, I opened my black leather notebook and wrote a single sentence. What role have I agreed to play? When you ask that question honestly, it changes something fundamental. Because once you see the role, you can't unsee it. I wasn't powerless. I was predictable. And predictability is comforting. For everyone except the person inside it. The shift didn't happen the next day. There was no confrontation. But something inside me stopped defaulting to accommodation. Not externally, internally. And that quiet internal shift was the beginning of everything that followed. The day something shifted wasn't dramatic. No argument, no accusation, no sudden betrayal. It was a Tuesday, rain against the glass panels. The kind of gray London morning where everything feels slightly muted. I arrived early, as usual. The office was quiet. Just the hum of monitors and the distant sound of the espresso machine warming up. I opened my inbox and saw a forwarded email chain. Subject line, Re-bonus allocation review. It hadn't been sent to me originally. Daniel had forwarded it with a short note. FYI, 3 letters. Inside the thread, senior finance leadership discussed departmental adjustments. I read carefully, not emotionally, just analytically. One sentence caught my attention. We can reclassify a portion of Whitaker's allocation under the discretionary pool, given her non-revenue-facing role. Non-revenue-facing. My work directly influenced margin preservation. It wasn't client-facing, but it absolutely impacted profitability. Further down, she's not likely to escalate. That line wasn't framed as a strategy. It was framed as reassurance. I didn't feel heat rise in my chest. I felt still. That was the shift. Because for the first time, I saw confirmation of something I had only sensed. My silence had been calculated into the decision, not maliciously, not dramatically, just factored in. Like risk assessment, they weren't targeting me. They were optimizing around expected resistance. And I had been categorized as low resistance. I closed the email. I didn't respond. I didn't forward it to myself. I didn't screenshot it. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and asked a different question. If they believe I won't escalate, why? The answer wasn't about personality. It was about precedent. I had never documented an objection formally. I had never requested written clarification beyond polite inquiry. I had never cited policy language in response to ambiguity. I had trusted verbal reassurance. And in corporate systems, verbal reassurance evaporates. That morning, instead of diving into reconciliation reports, I opened my employment contract again. Section 4.2. Performance-based bonuses will be calculated in alignment with documented individual metrics, unless otherwise formally amended in writing. I read it slowly, not searching for emotion, searching for structure. There was no amendment, no written revision, no clause granting discretionary override based on revenue-facing perception. The bonus wasn't purely discretionary. It was performance-based with defined parameters. That distinction mattered. For years, I had optimized for relational harmony. On that Tuesday, I shifted to structural clarity. I opened a new folder in my email. Title, Documentation. Inside it, I placed my signed contract, 3 years of performance reviews, KPI scorecards, the forwarded bonus allocation thread, no commentary, just organization. Then I did something subtle but significant. In my notebook, I rewrote the sentence from the leadership email. She's not likely to escalate. And beneath it, I wrote, they are relying on that. There's a profound difference between being underestimated and being structurally dismissed. The first can be advantageous. The second becomes a boundary question. I didn't storm into Daniel's office. I didn't draft an emotional email. I went back to work. But my silence changed quality. It was no longer passive. It was observational, measured, intentional. That day, I stopped trying to be perceived correctly. I started preparing to be positioned correctly. And positioning doesn't require volume. It requires patience. The shift wasn't anger. It was alignment. Alignment between what I knew and what I was willing to allow. And once that alignment forms, you can't return to unconscious compliance. You either act impulsively or you act strategically. I chose strategic, quietly. After that Tuesday, nothing about me appeared different. I still arrived early, still submitted clean reports, still spoke in measured tones during meetings. But internally, something precise had locked into place. Before, my silence had been reflexive, a habit shaped by years of believing that harmony preserved opportunity. Now my silence was selected, and that distinction changed how I moved. In the weeks that followed, I paid attention to how often assumptions were made in my presence. Rosie's fine with that. She'll sort it. No need to loop her in on this one. Before, I would have stepped in to reassure or clarify. Now I simply observed. I didn't correct minor inaccuracies about my preferences. I didn't volunteer extra availability unless formally requested. I didn't preemptively solve issues that hadn't been assigned. This wasn't withdrawal. It was recalibration. For the first time, I allowed small inefficiencies to surface publicly instead of intercepting them privately. When a projection error slipped through because I hadn't been included in the draft stage, I didn't rush to fix it overnight. I responded during business hours with documented notes and revision timelines. No hostility, just boundaries. Interestingly, the team interpreted my steadiness as continued compliance. Rosie's unbothered. Someone joked once when a timeline shifted abruptly. Unbothered. It was almost fascinating. They mistook composure for concession, silence for surrender. In meetings, I began asking different kinds of questions. Not defensive ones, structural ones. Can we confirm the performance weighting criteria in writing before finalizing allocations? Will this adjustment be formally documented in the compensation framework? Each question was calm, professional, unemotional. But questions create a record, and record creates accountability. I noticed subtle discomfort when conversations moved from verbal assurance to documented clarity. People prefer flexibility. Documentation removes flexibility. I also began tracking my contributions more meticulously, not privately in my notebook, but in shared systems. When I built a forecasting model, I stored it in centralized folders under my name. When I revised cross-departmental reports, I documented version histories. When I identified compliance risks, I summarized them in recap emails rather than hallway conversations. Nothing aggressive, just visible. If my silence had once protected others from scrutiny, it now protected me from ambiguity. And here's something unexpected. I felt calmer than I had in months, because I was no longer negotiating internally about whether something counted as unfair. I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. Daniel didn't sense the shift immediately. To him, I remained the reliable analyst who didn't escalate. But he began receiving more follow-up emails from me. Polite, precise confirmations of discussions. Just to recap our agreement from today's meeting, per our conversation, confirming that, language that creates a trail. One afternoon, he stopped by my desk. "You've been very thorough lately," he said lightly. "I always have been," I replied. It wasn't sarcasm. It was a fact. The difference was visibility. Silence, when chosen, becomes leverage. Because people project their expectations onto it. They assume continuity. They assume predictability. They assume you won't act beyond established patterns. And that assumption buys you time. Time to understand systems fully. Time to identify leverage points. Time to decide whether correction is possible internally or whether a more definitive step is required. I wasn't rushing. I wasn't angry. I was collecting clarity. And clarity is powerful precisely because it doesn't announce itself. From the outside, I was still the safety net. But inside, I had stopped cushioning falls that weren't mine to absorb. And the quieter I became, the more comfortable everyone else grew. That comfort would matter later, because the moment I chose to speak, it wouldn't sound emotional. It would sound structural. And structural statements are very difficult to dismiss. Preparation rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It looks like routine. After my silence became intentional, I didn't accelerate. I deepened. Most people prepare emotionally. They rehearse confrontations in their heads. They imagine speeches. I prepared administratively. First, I mapped the compensation structure in detail, not the summarized slide version, the actual governance documents. I pulled archived HR memos outlining how performance-based bonuses were calculated over the past 5 years. I compared the weighting language. I reviewed whether any formal amendments had been distributed company-wide. There were none. The discretionary pool existed, but it was defined separately from performance-based allocations. The language in my contract was specific, calculated in alignment with documented individual metrics, unless otherwise formally amended in writing. No amendment had been issued to me. Second, I reconstructed my performance trail. I compiled KPI dashboards with timestamps, revenue impact summaries tied to my projects, email confirmations from leadership acknowledging margin improvements, audit feedback citing operational accuracy. Not to boast, to quantify. I wasn't building a case fueled by emotion. I was building a file immune to interpretation. Then I did something subtle that no one noticed. I requested a copy of the internal compensation policy directly from HR, framed as professional development. I'd like to better understand how allocation structures align with performance metrics, I wrote. They sent it without hesitation. Why wouldn't they? I had never challenged anything before. The document confirmed what I already suspected. Performance-based bonuses required alignment with documented metrics unless formally revised. Departmental weighting could adjust pools, but not override contractual terms without written amendment. There it was. Not dramatic, not explosive, just misalignment. And misalignment, in corporate environments, is vulnerability. While gathering documentation, I also observed behavioral patterns. Who approved final compensation numbers? Which finance controller signed off? What was the escalation path for contractual disputes? I wasn't planning to threaten anyone. I was mapping the structure. Structure determines outcome far more than personality. Meanwhile, externally, I remained consistent. Still polite, still delivering, still attending meetings without visible tension. I even congratulated Tom when he received a spotlight assignment. Sincerity disarms suspicion. But beneath that calm, I was positioning myself carefully. One evening, alone in the office, I printed my employment contract. Not because digital copies weren't sufficient, but because paper forces focus. I read every clause slowly. Compensation, amendments, dispute resolution procedures. Section 9.1 outlined formal notice requirements for contractual disagreements. Written notification. Clear reference to the clause. Opportunity for internal correction prior to external arbitration. I underlined that section. Not in red yet, just marked. Here's what they never noticed. I stopped over-delivering beyond the defined scope. I delivered exactly what my role required, impeccably. No extra hours unrecorded. No informal corrections are undocumented. No silent coverage for other people's oversight. When inefficiencies surfaced because I hadn't preemptively solved them, leadership began asking more questions. Why wasn't this caught earlier? I answered honestly. I wasn't included in the initial review phase. Not accusatory. Factual. Documentation protects tone, the subtle consequence. They began looping me in earlier again. Predictability was re-established, but now with clearer boundaries. The most important preparation, though, wasn't administrative. It was psychological. I asked myself repeatedly, if they refuse correction when presented with structural evidence, am I prepared to follow through? Because leverage only exists if you're willing to use it. Empty threats weaken a position, so I evaluated options carefully. Internal clarification. Formal written notice. Escalation to HR. External legal review. None of these required shouting. They required documentation. By the end of that month, I had a folder digital and physical, containing everything necessary to demonstrate contractual misalignment. I still hadn't sent a single confrontational message, but I no longer felt uncertain. Preparation replaces resentment with clarity, and clarity changes posture. People sense posture shifts even when they can't name them. Daniel began being slightly more careful in phrasing around me. The CFO CC'd me directly on a margin discussion thread. Small adjustments, subtle recalibrations. They didn't know why. They just felt something had become firmer. And they were right. Because when you move from emotional reaction to structural preparation, you stop hoping for fairness. You position for it, quietly. The realization didn't arrive with adrenaline. It arrived with arithmetic. Late one Thursday evening, after most of the office had emptied, I sat at my desk with 3 documents open side by side. My signed employment contract, the internal compensation policy, the finalized bonus allocation sheet. I wasn't looking for injustice anymore. I was looking for alignment. Line by line, I compared language. The contract stated, performance-based bonuses calculated in alignment with documented individual metrics, unless formally amended in writing. The policy stated, discretionary adjustments may apply to departmental pools, but must remain consistent with contractual obligations. The allocation sheet showed my bonus partially reclassified under discretionary weighting, without written amendment, without performance deficiency, without formal notice. It wasn't ambiguous. It was inconsistent. That was the private reveal. Not that they had been cruel, not that they had targeted me, but they had assumed compliance would neutralize risk, and they had done so in writing. She's not likely to escalate. That sentence replayed in my mind, not as an insult, but as a miscalculation. Because escalation wasn't emotional. Escalation was procedural. And procedures, when followed correctly, leave very little room for interpretation. I leaned back in my chair and felt something unexpected. Not triumph, not vindication. Clarity. The leverage wasn't explosive. It wasn't scandalous. It was clean. If I submitted a formal written notice citing Section 4.2 and requested documented justification for reclassification without amendment, the company would have 2 options. I had never received a signed amendment. Correct the allocation. There was no third option that preserved internal policy consistency. Finance departments fear inconsistency more than confrontation. Inconsistency creates audit vulnerability. I knew that intimately. And in that moment, I understood something deeper. I didn't need to argue value. I needed to reference the structure. Value is subjective. Structure is enforceable. I printed the relevant pages and placed them side by side on my desk. For the first time, I took a red pen and underlined the exact sentence in Section 4.2, not dramatically, just clearly. I didn't draft the email that night, because leverage is strongest when not used impulsively. Instead, I closed my laptop and sat quietly. If I sent that email, the role assigned to me would dissolve permanently. I would no longer be the predictable safety net. I would become someone who documents misalignment and requests correction. That changes how organizations categorize you. Some doors open, some doors close. I had to decide whether I was prepared for both outcomes. The money mattered, but not in isolation. What mattered was precedent. If I allowed contractual misalignment once, it would reappear. Perhaps more subtly. Perhaps framed differently. But systems repeat tolerated behavior. I thought about my younger self. The version of me who believed being indispensable guaranteed fairness. It doesn't. Indispensable people are often the last to challenge structure because they fear destabilizing what they built. But stability without equity erodes slowly, and erosion is quiet. I gathered the documents into a slim folder and placed them inside my bag next to my black notebook. The office lights flickered into nighttime dimming mode. As I walked out into the cool London air, I felt steady. The reveal hadn't changed who I was. It clarified who I needed to be. There would be no dramatic confrontation, no emotional speech, just one email. Precise, referencing one clause, highlighted in red, and sent to the correct recipients. But before that, there was one final decision to make. Not about legality, about identity. Was I ready to stop being the person they assumed I would remain? Because once you correct a structural imbalance, you cannot return to invisibility. And invisibility for a long time had felt safe. I didn't send the email the next morning. I opened a blank draft, then I closed it. Because the decision wasn't about wording, it was about consequence. There were multiple paths in front of me. I could request an informal clarification meeting, frame it as confusion. I could ask Daniel to look into it again. I could accept the loss and focus on building visibility elsewhere. I could begin searching quietly for a new role and exit without friction. All of those options preserved comfort. Only one preserved precedent. The irreversible option wasn't aggressive, it was formal. A written notice referencing contractual language was sent to Daniel, HR, and the finance controller, who signed off on allocations. Once documented, it would enter the official record. And official records shift power dynamics. I made tea and sat at my kitchen table that evening with my notebook open. On one page, I wrote, "If I stay silent, bonus loss absorbed, pattern reinforced, future allocations vulnerable, reputation unchanged." On the opposite page, "If I submit a formal notice, immediate discomfort, structural correction likely, reputation redefined, long-term positioning strengthened." I stared at the second list for a long time. Discomfort. That was the real cost. Not retaliation. Not termination. I had too much documented performance value for that to be realistic. The cost was perception. I would no longer be easy. I would no longer be low maintenance. I would be precise. And precision unsettles people who benefit from vagueness. I asked myself one final question. If they had reclassified someone they believed would escalate, would they have done it differently? The answer was obvious. Yes. Which meant the only variable in the equation was expected resistance. That settled it. This wasn't about proving worth. It was about correcting expectations. The next morning, I arrived at the office slightly earlier than usual. I didn't rush. I didn't avoid eye contact. I even chatted briefly with Tom about his upcoming presentation. Then I opened a new email draft. Subject line, clarification request. Bonus allocation alignment. Section 4.2. Calm, specific, unemotional. In the body, I wrote, "Dear Daniel, I am writing to formally request clarification regarding the recent reclassification of my performance-based bonus allocation. Per Section 4.2 of my signed employment agreement, performance-based bonuses are to be calculated in alignment with documented individual metrics, unless otherwise formally amended in writing. I have not received notice of any amendment applicable to my role. Could you please provide written confirmation of the amendment authorizing this adjustment, or confirm alignment with the contractual terms outlined above? Kind regards, Rosie." Then, beneath the quoted clause, I pasted a screenshot of the contract section. I highlighted the relevant sentence in red, not aggressively, just clearly. I added HR and the finance controller to CC. I read the email 3 times. No accusation, no emotional language, no threat. Just structure. This was the irreversible step. Because once sent, silence would no longer be my defining trait. I hovered over the send button for less than 5 seconds. Not because I doubted the logic, because I understood the shift it represented. Then I clicked and returned to my spreadsheet. No announcement, no visible tension, just quiet alignment. The decision had been made. After I clicked send, nothing dramatic happened. No immediate reply. No urgent meeting request. No visible ripple across the office floor. That's the thing about structural moves. They don't explode. They circulate. I returned to my work exactly as before. Reconciliations. Forecast updates. Variance notes. My posture didn't change. My tone didn't sharpen. If anyone had looked at me mid-morning, they would have seen the same composed analyst reviewing line items. But internally, something had settled. There was no longer ambiguity between what I knew and what I was willing to accept. At 10:17 a.m., Daniel replied, "Received. Let me review with HR and revert." Short, neutral, no defensiveness. That was important. Defensiveness would have implied emotional framing. Neutrality implied review. Within an hour, the finance controller removed herself from 2 unrelated email threads I was CC'd on. Subtle behavioral tightening. When documentation enters the room, people become precise. By early afternoon, HR sent a meeting invite. Compensation alignment discussion, 30 minutes. Scheduled for the following morning. Again, calm. No language suggesting conflict. No urgent escalation markers. That evening, I prepared for the meeting the same way I prepared quarterly reports. I printed the highlighted contract clause, my KPI scorecards for the year, the internal compensation policy excerpt, the bonus allocation sheet. No commentary added. No annotations beyond the red highlight. I wasn't preparing an argument. I was preparing a reference set. The meeting the next morning was small. Daniel, HR business partner Amelia, and me. Amelia began with professional composure. Rosie, thank you for raising this. We want to ensure clarity. Clarity. Good word. Daniel explained that the discretionary pool had required strategic rebalancing. He emphasized budget pressure, broader considerations, standard practice. I listened fully before speaking. Then I placed the printed contract on the table. I understand departmental rebalancing, I said evenly. My question is limited to contractual alignment. Section 4.2 specifies calculation in alignment with documented individual metrics, unless formally amended in writing. I have not received an amendment. No accusation, just reference. Amelia reviewed the page carefully. Was a written amendment issued to this role classification? She asked Daniel. He hesitated slightly. Not specifically to Rosie's contract. There it was. Amelia nodded slowly. In that case, we'll need to review whether the allocation aligns with the contractual framework. No raised voices, no defensiveness, just structure correcting structure. The meeting ended with, "We'll revert within 48 hours. And then, nothing. No gossip circulated. No colleague pulled me aside. No manager treated me coldly. Because I hadn't attacked anyone. I had cited policy. And policy doesn't bruise egos. It exposes misalignment. The most powerful part? I didn't follow up aggressively. I let the documentation do the work. 2 days later, at 4:32 p.m., I received a brief email from HR. Following review, we confirm that your performance-based bonus will be recalculated in alignment with contractual terms. Updated documentation to follow. No apology, no elaboration, just a correction. Finance processed the payment within 24 hours. Quietly, no announcement, no admission of error, just alignment. I didn't celebrate. I didn't forward the email to anyone. I simply updated my notebook. Date, outcome, and one final note beneath it. Expectation corrected. But the consequences of that correction were only beginning to unfold. When the payment reflected in my account, it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like equilibrium, but equilibrium shifts systems. And systems react, not emotionally but behaviorally. The first change was subtle. In meetings, Daniel began attributing models to me by name. Rosie built the forecasting sensitivity here. Not grand recognition, just accurate attribution. Accuracy is contagious. Once something has been formally corrected, people become cautious about repeating imprecision. The second shift came in email threads. I was CC'd earlier in strategic conversations. Not after drafts were finalized, but during formation stages. Inclusion is often less about generosity and more about risk management. If I had demonstrated that I read clauses carefully, it would have made sense to include me before decisions crystallized. No one referenced the bonus incident directly, but something had recalibrated. I was no longer categorized as unlikely to escalate. I was categorized as procedurally aware. That difference matters. Tom approached me one afternoon with an unusual tone. I heard there was some adjustment around bonuses, he said carefully. All sorted now? His phrasing told me something important. Information had circulated, but without detail. Yes, I replied. It was a contractual clarification. He nodded, slightly more respectful than before. Clarification, not conflict. Language shapes perception. The most interesting consequence, though, was internal. I noticed that I no longer volunteered to cushion ambiguity. When deadlines were unrealistic, I asked for formal reprioritization. When the scope expanded, I requested updated documentation reflecting it. No defensiveness, just alignment. At first, colleagues seemed slightly unsettled. Not hostile, just recalculating. The safety net had acquired edges. And here's the quiet truth. People trust edges. They may not say it, but boundaries create reliability. Because when someone protects their own structural fairness calmly, they are more likely to protect collective structure as well. Within weeks, I was invited to join a compensation framework review committee. The irony wasn't lost on me. Given your attention to policy alignment, Amelia said, we'd value your input. Attention to policy alignment. That's how organizations reframe strength once they recognize it. The role assigned to me had shifted. Still reliable, still analytical, but no longer invisible. What they didn't realize was that I hadn't changed my competence. I had changed my tolerance. And tolerance shapes identity more than skill does. There were, of course, small ripples of discomfort. Daniel was slightly more measured around me, more precise with wording. Not distant, just aware. And awareness is healthy. Because leadership without accountability drifts. I hadn't embarrassed him. I hadn't escalated externally. I hadn't accused. I had corrected internally. That preserved dignity on all sides. But it also removed the assumption that I would absorb structural disadvantage quietly. That assumption had been convenient. Its absence required recalibration. One evening, as I reviewed quarterly projections, I realized something surprising. I no longer felt the quiet resentment that had once hummed beneath my work. Not because I had won, because I had aligned. The organization had revealed its structure. I had responded structurally, and the correction had occurred without explosion. That's the power of quiet dominance. Not force, not humiliation, alignment that cannot be argued against. Still, consequences rarely end with one correction. Because once you demonstrate that you can act calmly, precisely, people begin reevaluating where else they may have relied on your silence. And that reevaluation was only beginning. The interesting thing about correcting a system quietly is that it forces everyone to reassess their assumptions, even the ones they didn't realize they were making. A few weeks after the bonus adjustment was processed, annual promotion discussions began circulating internally, not formally announced, but visible in calendar patterns. Private meeting clusters, closed-door sessions. Historically, I had been adjacent to these conversations, not central. This time, something felt different. Daniel scheduled a one-on-one with me titled Career Trajectory Discussion. The phrasing was new. We sat across from each other in the small glass meeting room overlooking the street. He seemed composed, but more deliberate than usual. "I want to talk about your long-term growth here," he began. Long-term growth. For years, that conversation had included the same phrase, build executive visibility. Now the tone shifted. "You've demonstrated strong ownership recently," he continued, "particularly in ensuring alignment with policy." Ownership, alignment. Language evolves when perception changes. I listened quietly. Then he said something that revealed more than he likely intended. "I think in the past, we may have underestimated how closely you track structural details." May have underestimated. There it was, spoken plainly. Not maliciously, just honestly. And once that sentence is spoken, it cannot be unsaid, because it confirms what was previously unacknowledged. The problem for them wasn't that I had escalated. It was that the previous version of me, the one they believed would always absorb ambiguity, no longer existed. You can't fix that perception retroactively. You can adjust behavior going forward, but you cannot return to the comfort of assumption. In leadership meetings, I noticed subtle tension when compensation frameworks were discussed. More documentation, more careful phrasing, more cross-checking of contractual clauses. My email had done more than correct my own bonus. It had signaled that documentation would be read carefully. One afternoon, I overheard a senior manager say, "Let's make sure this is fully aligned before it goes out." Before, fully aligned had been aspirational language. Now it carried weight. The panic wasn't visible, but it was procedural. They reviewed allocation criteria more thoroughly that year. They issued clearer written explanations. They formalized language that had previously been flexible, not because they feared me personally, because systems adapt to the highest standard enforced within them. Here's the quiet truth. Once you demonstrate willingness to enforce structure calmly, it raises the bar for everyone. And for those who benefited from flexibility, that shift can feel like a loss. Not loss of money, loss of assumption. Daniel tried subtly to reestablish relational ease, inviting me to more informal check-ins, asking for my perspective earlier in projects. It wasn't manipulative, it was an adjustment. But there was something that could not be restored. The original categorization. I was no longer the low-risk, non-escalating analyst. I was someone who would act if alignment failed. And once someone knows that about you, the dynamic changes permanently. Too late to fix it. Not in a vindictive sense, but in a structural one. You cannot unsee leverage once revealed. You cannot unknow that someone reads contracts line by line. You cannot comfortably reclassify someone's compensation when they've demonstrated precise awareness. The system had corrected itself, but the comfort of underestimation was gone. And for some, that was the real disruption. The actual confrontation, if you could call it that, happened almost a month later. It wasn't scheduled. It wasn't dramatic. It occurred in the quiet aftermath of a compensation committee meeting I had been newly invited to attend. We were reviewing proposed framework adjustments for the next fiscal year. Language refinements. Documentation clarity. Safeguards against interpretive weighting. I noticed Daniel watching me once or twice as I asked precise questions. Not aggressive ones, just exact. Will this clause require written acknowledgement from impacted employees? Is there a version control log attached to amendments? After the meeting ended, he lingered. Rosie, do you have a minute? We stayed in the conference room while others filtered out. He didn't look defensive. He looked thoughtful. I want to address something directly, he said. I waited. When the bonus situation happened, I didn't anticipate you would escalate it formally. The word escalate again, used neutrally. I didn't escalate emotionally, I replied calmly. I referenced the contract. He nodded. I realized that, and you were right to. There was no tension in the room, no raised voices, just acknowledgement. He continued. I think we got used to you absorbing structural gray areas without pushing back. That sentence mattered more than the bonus ever did, because it articulated the pattern. I allowed that, I said simply. It wasn't blame. It was a fact. Silence participates in its own interpretation. Daniel exhaled lightly. For what it's worth, the way you handled it was professional. It forced us to tighten things in a good way. That was the closest thing to an apology I would receive. And it was enough. I'm not interested in conflict, I said. I'm interested in alignment. That was the entire philosophy distilled. Conflict exhausts. Alignment corrects. He studied me for a moment, perhaps recalibrating the image he had carried for years. You've shifted, he said quietly. No, I replied. I've clarified. There was no hostility between us, no lingering bitterness, just a new understanding. The confrontation wasn't about winning. It was about redefining boundaries without theatrics. Because here's what people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It isn't about overpowering others. It's about removing ambiguity around what you will tolerate. And once ambiguity disappears, so does casual overreach. As we left the room, Daniel said one final thing. I should have been more precise earlier. Yes, I agreed softly. No accusation, no lecture, just acknowledgement of a structural lapse. And that was it. No raised temperatures, no reputational fallout, no drama whispered through hallways, just a recalibrated professional dynamic. When confrontation is stripped of ego, it becomes instruction. And instruction, delivered calmly, reshapes systems more effectively than outrage ever could. I returned to my desk and opened my notebook. Under the original sentence, they are relying on that. I added one more line. Reliance withdrawn. Not loudly, just clearly. If you met me now, you might not immediately notice the difference. I still speak calmly. I still prepare thoroughly. I still prefer substance over spectacle. But something fundamental has shifted. I no longer confuse usefulness with value. For years, I believed that being indispensable would naturally translate into fairness. That if I made myself essential enough, accurate enough, reliable enough, steady enough, recognition and structural alignment would follow. Sometimes they do, but systems do not reward silent endurance automatically. They reward clarity. Today, I am still reliable, but I am also explicit. When the scope expands, I ask for updated documentation. When performance is evaluated, I request written criteria in advance. When contributions are presented, I ensure authorship is recorded accurately, not through confrontation, but through inclusion. I'll circulate the draft under my name. I'll say lightly, happy to walk leadership through the model I built. The tone hasn't changed. The boundary has. Interestingly, the respect feels different now. Less affectionate, more precise. Colleagues ask for my opinion earlier in decision-making processes. Leadership requests my review before finalizing policy language. I'm included in strategic discussions that once bypassed me. Not because I demanded access, because I demonstrated awareness. There's a quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can enforce structure without raising your voice. It changes how you carry yourself. I don't over-explain anymore. I don't soften clear statements into suggestions unnecessarily. If something requires correction, I reference policy. If something aligns, I acknowledge it. And I don't apologize for protecting contractual clarity. The most surprising change, though, isn't external. It's internal. The subtle hum of resentment I once carried, the quiet questioning of whether I was being overlooked, has disappeared. Not because I became louder, because I became aligned. I no longer wait for others to define the perimeter of my role. I define it structurally. And here's the important part. There is no bitterness attached to this transformation. Daniel and I work well together. HR consults me on framework drafts. The system didn't collapse because I cited one clause. It improved. Because fairness enforced calmly strengthens organizations. Quiet dominance isn't cold. It's clear. It doesn't humiliate. It calibrates. And perhaps most importantly, I no longer seek invisibility for safety. I understand now that visibility doesn't require volume. It requires self-definition. The black leather notebook still sits in my bag every day. But now, when I write in it, I'm not recording small cuts. I'm recording boundaries honored. The role once assigned to me, reliable, useful, invisible, has evolved. Reliable, yes. Useful, absolutely. Invisible, not anymore. And the most powerful part is this. I didn't become someone else. I simply stopped participating in a version of myself that benefited everyone but me. When people hear this story, they often focus on the red highlight, on the email, on the clause, on the fact that finance processed the payment within 24 hours. But that wasn't the most important moment. The most important moment was Tuesday morning when I read, "She's not likely to escalate," and realized that my silence had been calculated into a decision. That was the turning point, not because it hurt, because it clarified. We talk a lot about speaking up as if it requires volume, as if justice demands confrontation, intensity, or public exposure. Sometimes it does, but often it simply requires documentation, clarity, a calm sentence that cannot be reasonably dismissed. They withheld my bonus. I sent the contract clause highlighted in red. That sentence sounds dramatic. In reality, it was procedural. It was quiet alignment between what was written and what was done. No one was humiliated. No one was threatened. No bridges were burned. A boundary was defined. And once defined, it was respected. Here's what I learned. If you consistently absorb ambiguity, people will factor that into their decisions. If you consistently clarify structure, people will factor that in instead. You don't have to become aggressive to be taken seriously. You don't have to perform outrage to correct misalignment. You just have to be willing to reference the framework and accept that once you do, your identity inside that system will shift. Quiet dominance isn't about overpowering others. It's about removing the assumption that you will tolerate structural unfairness. And once that assumption disappears, the room changes. So I'm curious, have you ever realized that your silence was being calculated into someone else's decision? And if you did you choose to stay silent? Or did you choose to clarify?
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.